Charlie Kirk and Vaush debated libertarian socialism and freedom on Tim Pool's show. Take a look.
Now, it's funny. I feel like our roles are being reversed a little bit here.
Isn't that interesting?
The common good isn't something I appeal to. For me, the value I want to maximize...
No, I just appeal to the good.
The good, sure. The
Which
good
is two different things.
Is freedom. That's what I care about most. And that's what libertarian socialism is about. There are many types of freedoms, positive and negative. If I might indulge very briefly, like, is a man thrown to a lawless desert without food, water, or clothing free? Really asking.
So, probably no.
I agree. He's free to die.
But that's an extreme example,
Sure.
Not applicable in modern wealthy America.
No,
or
but,
any Western nation.
But it's a philosophical base.
It's also a Rousseauian argument. Man's born free and he, spends the rest of his life in chains. It's just anti-commercial in nature.
Well, no, but it's a base philosophical argument because it's true. They're lawless. There's nothing preventing him from doing anything in that environment, but he has no ability to act on his
But do you know what he
desires.
does have? Consciousness.
Well, sure.
So that's a natural rights doctrine that I will defend.
Well, I mean, I like consciousness too. The only point that I'm getting at is when it comes to people's freedom and the ability for people to protect their freedom, this is what I care about. It's what Marx cared about. If you actually read what he wrote, and
I've read Das Kapital, I've read the Manifesto, and guess what? He was right about some things.
then you know.
But not everything.
He didn't
And he
talk
was really wrong
about equality. He didn't write on equality. He wrote on freedom because he believed that society was a very complex, interlocking network of systems that in some ways liberated men and in other ways enslaved them.
But do you know what he got wrong? He got wrong that sometimes people can be free for other devices that they are not able to regulate. They can be free not from alcoholism, drug addiction, some sort of any other sort of perverse addiction. The idea of freedom is a very libertarian.
But I agree with that, though.
No, I know you do.
The greatest society.
I say that. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just the greatest society is one where a man is born, and there are as few things as possible preventing him from doing whatever he wants for the rest of his life.
I totally disagree.
So long as, of course, he doesn't deprive others of the ability to do the same.
So I think that's a miserable society.
Freedom?
No, that's not freedom. That's licentiousness or degeneracy. That's chaos.
What is degeneracy? I like men.
How about pedophilia?
Okay. Well, obviously,
you said
that would
whatever
infringe-
he wants. Is
as long as
pedophilia
they don't-
freedom, Vaush?
As long as they don't infringe on the rights of others. I'm sure you could believe. I would believe.
Well,
that
so there are limits on freedom, is what you're saying. It's not this Wild West
Yeah,
campaign.
as
So where
long
do you
as you-
get those limits from?
Well, obviously, you would probably have to have a pretty complex interlocking legal system to determine what we agree upon as like a reasonable limits we can place on people's behavior. We have that now to an extent.
No, I know. So like pedophilia, bad.
That would be a bad thing.
Okay, kidnapping.
That would be a bad thing.
Rape.
That would be a bad thing.
Why do you think those things are bad?
I think they're bad because you're stripping other people of the ability to do that which they will. With all those examples, you're inflicting harm on a person.
How about dealing drugs?
I think that dealing drugs is a person's freedom, as is taking a
But
person's.
you're taking
What about dealing drugs to kids?
Dealing drugs to kids? I think I would disagree with that, probably because I think there's something exceptional about addictive substances and children. That being said, I think a lot of stuff would apply to children, specifically contract law. Kids can't sign contracts, but
So
there's
do
nothing
you
wrong
see what
with
I'm getting at?
contracts.
Eventually, you do agree that a conservative framework is necessary.
But I don't think that's a conservative framework, because there are other things I care about that you would always disagree with, like collective ownership of the means of production.
Yeah, I totally disagree. I think private property and freedom are linked together.
Which would give workers the most freedom possible.
We've definitely gone along. A libertarian socialist is like a meat eater vegan.
Libertarianism was actually a left-leaning ideology. It was co-opted in the early 20th centuries by capitalists, but actually before that, libertarianism was exclusively in the purview of socialists, and I believe what they believed, that freedom is the greatest human good as long as it doesn't infringe upon others, and that the best way to achieve that freedom is through democracy. We have political democracy, flawed as it is. Economic democracy is something we should also strive for.
I'll tell you.
So Vaush did a great job there, breaking down his view of libertarian socialism, breaking down his conception of freedom and what it would mean. There's a part earlier on in the conversation that you didn't see there where Charlie Kirk basically says, oh, actually, you may have seen it at the very beginning, where Charlie says, I want to appeal to the good or the common good. So he says that's what he bases his philosophy and his ideology on. And Vaush pushes back at one point and basically says, I mean, every authoritarian system known to man makes that argument that they're the ones who are pushing for the common good. And so you can get otherwise normal people to do horrendous things if they truly believe and have conceptualized that what they're doing is for the common good. Even if those things are, phenomenologically, obviously not good, if you can convince people that, no, this is for the greater good, for the common good, then they can do hideous, atrocious, horrendous things. So, it is sort of, the go-to of authoritarians to make that argument. The other issue is Charlie Kirk saying he believes in the common good. It's like, okay, but the common good as you, Charlie Kirk, define it. And he has some ideas that, are just sort of extreme, and it's very easy to argue against the ideas and say, this isn't the common good. For example, he comes out in this podcast against gay marriage. I mean, I'm sure he's always been against gay marriage, but he reiterated his opposition to gay marriage in this. It's hard to make the case that you're helping the common good by not letting two consenting adults who aren't hurting anybody else express their love in the most intimate way and create a lasting bond. It seems like even though you say you're fighting for the common good, you're not fighting for the common good or the good. It's the good as you have defined it, and you are incredibly socially, culturally, religiously biased in your specific, time and place and mindset. Like, you just happen to be born in America. He just happened to be born in, I'm going to guess, the 1980s. And all of the cultural biases and social biases and religious biases inform what you think is, quote-unquote, the common good or the good. So it just seems sort of ill thought out. Now, Vaush, on the other hand, he says the value he cares most about is freedom. And then he makes a phenomenal point of, would you really call somebody who's dropped in the middle of the desert with nothing free? And even Charlie Kirk acknowledges, no, that person's not free in any real meaningful sense. And so the point that Vaush is sort of fleshing out there is that we have all these different conceptions of what freedom is. There's negative freedom or negative liberty and positive freedom, positive liberty. And so in some ways you have a freedom from the government oppressing you. You have free speech. They can't lock you up for you speaking your mind. That's one example of like a negative freedom. I have a right for the government not to bust down my door with no evidence and no warrant and do a search of everything. That would be a negative freedom or negative liberty. Positive freedom would be like you have a right to healthcare, for example. And what Vaush is sort of laying out there is that person is not free in any real meaningful sense. The person who's left in the desert with nothing. And he goes on to point out that really the only way you can, in any meaningful sense, talk about human beings being free is if they're also not oppressed. So their basic needs are met, that's a given, but they're also not oppressed by their boss, their corporation, their business, where they work, in the same way that they're not supposed to be oppressed by the government. See, this is what libertarians and conservatives like to do, is they like to harp away on the oppression and the tyranny of the government, and the government taking away their rights. But they completely overlook the corporate sector doing the exact same thing. And Charlie Kirk even weakens his own position there by saying, I think private property and freedom are linked together. Private property and freedom are linked together. If you are a wealthy, let's say you're born into wealth. You inherited a business from your parents. And then you have 40 people working for you, let's say. The 40 people who are working for you, are they really free in any meaningful sense? If where they spend most of their time during the week, they get there and they have to do what you say, when you say it, with very few, if not no, guardrails to protect them. I mean, I guess you say, okay, you can't discriminate against ethnicity or religion, and they can't tell you to do sexual favors. There's very limited rules, but there's some. But they're really not in any meaningful sense free if when they get to the workplace, there's a rigid hierarchy and structure that actually mimics what we would call a political dictatorship, a political tyranny, an authoritarian system. So it's funny that these libertarians and conservatives can see the oppression of having that rigid hierarchy when it comes to the state. And it's, don't tread on me. Get the government out of my life. But when it comes to corporations oppressing you, being tyrannical, being dictatorial, taking away your right to really do what you want to do when you want to do it in any meaningful sense, somehow that is not taking away your rights. That is not infringing on your freedom when it most definitely is infringing on your freedom. And then Charlie Kirk points out what Vaush is describing, he says, is not freedom, it's degeneracy, it's chaos. Don't agree with that. And the example he gives is pedophilia. Now, Vaush accurately swats that away and says, listen, the reason why that's wrong, among many reasons, is that you are infringing on the rights of that kid to not be taken advantage of. So you're taking away the kids' rights. And that's why he's very clear in describing your rights stop where the infringing on other people's rights begins. And he says that repeatedly, even given that Charlie Kirk tries to blur those lines and make it seem like, no, the freedom you're advocating for is actually total degeneracy and chaos. And then they go to the example of drug use. And it does say a lot about how ultimately authoritarian the belief system of Charlie Kirk is, that he thinks it's a trump card, no pun intended using Trump, but he thinks it's a trump card to talk about drugs like it's not somebody's freedom, right? Now, they bring up kids. Again, I think Vaush is right to swat that aside, because when it comes to kids, they aren't fully formed physically. So there is no such thing as really making their own decision in any meaningful sense. So you can make a distinction between, a kid and an adult. Now, the line is blurry, and you could have a debate about where the line is, but there clearly is a reason to restrict it for younger people and don't restrict it for older people. But this notion that allowing people to put in their body what they want to put in their body if they're not hurting anybody else, if they're a grown adult, the notion that that's just degeneracy and that's just chaos, and it does speak to the fact that Charlie Kirk has a bleak view of human nature. And he even points this out in other parts of the podcast where he basically says, I think people are like disgusting and brutish and bad at their core. And I would say, now speaking for me now, not Vaush, I would say I just fundamentally disagree with that. And the plethora of the evidence points to the fact that we are both things. Human beings are both, altruistic and humanistic and collectivist and community-driven. We're that, and we are also selfish and greedy and brutish and all the negative things. Both of those things are in our nature. But he likes to focus on the negative, and he thinks we're just the negative by our nature. And so that's why giving people maximum freedom would actually be degeneracy and chaos and terrible. Well, I have to say, I don't agree with Charlie Kirk, and I think that worldview is phenomenally unappealing to independent viewers of this podcast. So I'll be like, really? So, in other words, even though he claims to be anti-authoritarian and anti-oppression and for rights and don't tread on me, he flips on that and changes it because he thinks if you do give people maximum freedom, then it's just degeneracy and chaos, and so you have to curtail that. Curtail that how? Well, you have to curtail that with how you govern. And so, in a weird way, he's for both the corporate oppression of people and he's for the government oppression of people, all the while pretending he's really not for either one. So I think Vaush does a great job there. Obviously, I tend to align more with his view on human nature. I tend to align more with his view on freedom and what constitutes real freedom. And I think this case needs to be made more often. That, yes, we should believe in this negative conception of freedom and liberty, where you have freedom from oppression and the government getting too involved in your life and all that. But also, we need to make the case that that's not just the government that could take away your freedom. It's also the workplace, which is why Vaush wants more democracy in the workplace. And positive freedom is also important, and people don't talk about that much in the U.S. So in other words, you don't just have a freedom from certain things, oppression, you have freedom to certain things, the bare minimums. Because if you don't have the bare minimums met when we can have the bare minimums met, then you're not free in any meaningful sense. Are you really free if you're going to go bankrupt from medical bills? Are you really free if you're going to die because you don't have access to healthcare? Are you really free if you have, student loan debt that you're never going to pay off until you're 78 years old? Are you really free if you don't have food, if you don't have a roof over your head? So there's not just negative freedoms. There's also positive freedoms. So what the left needs to do is make the case, we believe in both kinds of freedom. You have a freedom from oppression, whether it's from the government or from your boss and your corporate overlords, and you have a freedom to certain things to actually give you a bare minimum shot at making it in life and being happy and healthy and fruitful and have meaning and purpose. So, again, Vaush does a great job there. And this really does get to the core of just some fundamental differences between the conservative worldview and the left worldview. And, I think Charlie's... he has positions on this stuff. I just sort of disagree, even going all the way back to his premises.